When my son was little, he was afraid of the dark and wouldn't fall asleep unless I held his hand. And then, years later, I held his hand in a courtroom, right before leading him to the man who would take him away. I hoped he would forgive me. But more than that, I hoped he would stay alive. It wasn't a choice between good and evil. It was a choice between a coffin and a cell. And I chose the bars because everything else was worse. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Lauren Blake. I was 48 years old, and I worked as a fire dispatch operator in a small town in North Carolina, a place where everyone knew your face and probably your mother's maiden name. I'd lived there all my life. My house sat on a quiet street 2 blocks from the Methodist church and a few steps from a gas station that never changed its prices fast enough. The porch creaked when you stepped on it, and the screen door always slammed just a little too hard, no matter how gently you tried to close it. My days were built on predictability. I worked 12-hour shifts in a room filled with blinking monitors and tired voices, answering calls that ranged from kitchen fires to car wrecks to panicked screams in the middle of the night. I had learned how to stay calm, how to make my voice a lifeline when someone's world was caving in. I kept everything in its place: numbers, times, addresses, protocols. That was the job. You couldn't panic when someone was dying on the other end of the line. You had to be the steel in the chaos. At home, I kept routines like prayers. I folded my towels a certain way. I made my bed before leaving the house, even if I was already running late. I drank my coffee black and read the newspaper from back to front, starting with obituaries, not because I was morbid, but because I liked to know who was gone before I learned who was getting married or running for city council. Life felt easier to process that way, from endings to beginnings. I loved quiet things, mornings when the sun hadn't fully risen, the sound of the kettle, the feel of fresh sheets. I planted roses in the backyard, mostly red and white, and spoke to them more than I spoke to my neighbors. They bloomed every spring, no matter how harsh the winter had been. I liked that. It gave me hope. That, and the fact that no matter how many fires burned in town, my house always felt untouched, whole, safe. I had one son, Joshua. He was 26 now. When I thought about him, it was always in fragments. His small hand clutching mine in the grocery store, the way he used to laugh with his whole body, the late nights we'd stay up building puzzles on the living room floor. He used to be so gentle, so bright. He played the piano when he was younger. I still kept his sheet music in the hall closet, even though the piano was long gone. His father left when Josh was 9, packed a bag, and said he couldn't breathe in this town anymore. I watched the taillights disappear down our street and told myself I'd be enough for our son. For a long time, I believed that. I worked double shifts to keep us afloat, kept the lights on, and the lunches packed, and the birthdays remembered. I showed up at parent-teacher nights in wrinkled uniforms and smiled like it didn't hurt to sit alone in the auditorium. Josh didn't say much about his father after he left. He just grew quieter. His eyes started drifting in pictures, never looking at the camera. I told myself he'd grow out of it. For a while, he did okay. He played soccer, made decent grades, made me laugh with his impressions of teachers he didn't like. But something changed in high school. Slowly, then all at once. He began coming home late. His eyes looked duller, his skin more hollow. I told myself it was just teenage rebellion. I told myself all boys go through phases. But then things started going missing. $20 from my wallet, a gold bracelet that belonged to my mother, the spare car keys. His excuses were flimsy. his anger quick to rise. There were nights I stayed up listening for the sound of the front door, praying it would open, praying it wouldn't bring a stranger in instead. I still remember the first time I found a syringe. It was tucked behind the toilet in the downstairs bathroom, wrapped in a paper towel like it could be hidden from the world if only covered just enough. My hands shook as I held it. I dropped it into a plastic bag and buried it in the trash. That night, I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time he had smiled like he meant it. He stopped calling me Mom around then. Just Lauren, sometimes, hey. His voice had lost its music. I'd find him asleep on the couch in the middle of the day, or up all night pacing the kitchen. Once, I found him curled on the bathroom floor, his face pale, his lips dry. He swore it was just a bad reaction to something he ate. I didn't believe him, but I didn't say so. I tried everything. I tried yelling. I tried begging. I tried logic. I tried silence. I offered therapy, rehab, church, home-cooked meals. I offered ultimatums and forgiveness, over and over again, like some broken wheel that couldn't stop spinning. He would disappear for a few days and come back thinner, angrier. He'd steal something, pawn it, come home with fast food and a lie. I hated him sometimes, and then hated myself for hating him, because underneath it all, I still saw the boy who used to hum to himself while brushing his teeth, who once cried because he stepped on a snail. People at work started noticing. I came in late. I snapped at callers. My hands trembled when I poured my coffee. I said I wasn't sleeping well. They didn't ask why. In a town like ours, people don't ask unless they already know. And they knew. Everyone did. They whispered about the Blake boy, junkie, thief, waste. I heard it at the grocery store, at church, even from the neighbor whose kid once played with Josh in the sprinklers. I wanted to scream at them, to shake them and say, "He's still in there, that boy, he's still my son." But I didn't. I just kept walking. The hardest part wasn't the anger. It wasn't the lies or the theft or the fear that he'd end up dead in some alley. The hardest part was watching the world forget he had ever been more than his addiction, watching it strip him down to the worst parts of his story, and knowing that I couldn't stop it. I used to think being a mother meant protecting your child from everything bad, that if you loved hard enough, you could shield them from the world. But now I knew sometimes love meant letting the world hit them, hoping they'd survive it. Sometimes love meant stepping aside, watching them fall, and praying the ground would be kinder than you feared. And still, every night, I left the porch light on, just in case he came home, just in case he needed to see that someone was still waiting, because I was, even when he wasn't my son anymore, even when he had become someone I didn't recognize, even when the life I had built was crumbling under the weight of his destruction. I waited, and I hoped, and I feared, because I still loved him, and I didn't know how to stop. It happened slowly, the way a river carves its way through stone, inch by inch, moment by moment, until one day the shape of your life is completely different and you can't remember when the erosion began. By the time I realized how far things had gone, I was already standing on the edge, watching the current pull him under. My son, my only child, and I was powerless to stop it. The phone calls started first. Strangers, neighbors, people from the edges of my life, all with the same hesitant tone. They used words like incident and trouble and police report. Once it was a broken window at the hardware store, then a stolen wallet, then the whisper that someone had been selling pills out of a car near the high school. Every time his name was mentioned, I felt a chill move through me, a slow, creeping frost that numbed my chest. I wanted to believe it wasn't true, that the world was wrong about him. But deep down, I already knew. A mother always knows, even when she's still pretending she doesn't. He came home one night just before dawn. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, staring at the empty chair across from me. When the door opened, I smelled gasoline and sweat and something sharp, like adrenaline turned sour. His clothes were torn, his eyes glassy. He didn't say a word. He went straight to his room and slammed the door. I sat there, listening to his footsteps, my heart heavy and frantic at the same time. I knew I should have gone after him, demanded answers, screamed, begged, anything. But I didn't. I just sat there, the silence pressing against my ribs until it hurt to breathe. The next morning, I found the drawer in the hallway half open, the lockbox missing. Inside that box had been my wedding ring, my father's watch, and a small envelope of cash I kept for emergencies. It was all gone. The space it had left behind was like a wound, empty, raw, undeniable. I stood there, my hands trembling, and realized something inside me had shifted. Not broken, not yet, but moved, like a fault line waking beneath the surface. I told myself I would give him one more chance, but even as I thought it, I knew there were no chances left to give. A week later, I got a call from a police officer I knew from the station. He spoke carefully, as if stepping around glass. They had found my son in the back of a car with a group of others, all of them high, one of them barely conscious. They hadn't arrested him, yet. But it was only a matter of time. The words, "next time," echoed through my mind long after the call ended. Next time could mean a morgue, a headline, a grave. I sat in the dark that night, turning his baby photo over in my hands, tracing the soft outline of his smile. I wondered when he had stopped being that child, when I had stopped being enough. The breaking point came 3 days later. I was at work when my neighbor called. There had been a break-in. The back door of her garage had been kicked open, her husband's tools gone. I drove home in a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. When I reached the house, he was there, sitting on the porch, a cigarette dangling between his fingers, his face pale and defiant. There was a duffel bag beside him, half unzipped, full of things that didn't belong to him. Hammers, drills, a pair of muddy boots. He didn't look at me as I approached. He just exhaled, the smoke curling upward into the humid Carolina air. The smell of oil and rust hung between us. I don't remember what I said, or if I said anything at all. Words had stopped meaning much between us by then. What I do remember is the way my hands shook as I reached for the phone. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even fear. It was something colder, quieter, a strange, hollow kind of certainty. I knew what I was about to do would destroy whatever was left between us, but I also knew that if I didn't do it, the next call I'd receive wouldn't be from a police officer. It would be from the coroner. I dialed 911. My voice didn't tremble. I told them there was a robbery suspect at my address. I gave them the details. I said the words clearly, carefully, as if reading a script. When I hung up, I stood there in the doorway, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out everything else. Outside, I could hear the faint wail of sirens growing closer. He finally looked up at me then. His eyes, those same eyes that once watched cartoons and asked endless questions about the stars, met mine. And in that instant, I saw it all, the betrayal, the confusion, the terror. I wanted to tell him I was sorry. I wanted to take it back. But it was too late. The line had already been crossed. The police arrived quickly. The blue and red lights painted our street in colors that didn't belong there. They cuffed him while he swore, while he twisted, while he screamed things that tore through me like shrapnel. I stood still, my hands at my sides, my body rigid with something that felt like grief and guilt fused together. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just watched as they led him to the car, his head turned away, his shoulders hunched like a cornered animal. The door closed with a dull, final sound. Then the car drove off, its lights vanishing into the distance, leaving me alone in the wake of what I had done. The house was too quiet after that. I wandered from room to room, touching the things he'd left behind. A half-empty soda can, a jacket draped over a chair, a broken picture frame. Each object felt like a fragment of a life that had already ended. I sat on the edge of his bed, the sheets still creased from the last time he slept there, and let the stillness press down on me. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. A car passed. The world kept moving, indifferent. But mine had stopped. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face in the moment they took him away. Not the anger that I could have borne, but the look of recognition, the understanding that it was me, that his mother had been the one to turn him in. I wondered what that would do to him, to us, to me. I wondered if, in trying to save his life, I had destroyed it. Morning came gray and brittle. I went to work because I didn't know what else to do. I answered calls, directed help, told people to stay calm while their houses burned or their loved ones bled. My voice didn't shake once. No one could tell that my own house was ashes, that my own heart was bleeding out quietly under my uniform. I moved through the day like a ghost wearing my own skin. When I got home that evening, the porch light was still on. It had burned all day, a small, stubborn flame against the gathering dark. I left it that way. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was guilt. I didn't know anymore. What I did know was this: there was no going back. I had crossed the line between love and fear, between mother and judge, between protector and betrayer. I had done the one thing I swore I never would. And yet, deep down, beneath the agony and the doubt, there was a sliver of something else, something I was almost ashamed to name: relief. Because at least for one night I knew where he was. He wasn't on the street. He wasn't in an alley. He wasn't dead. He was alive, and I was the one who made sure of it. The first time I saw him behind glass, it felt like looking into a world where the rules of gravity no longer applied. Everything that used to make sense, the warmth of a hug, the safety of our kitchen, the simple rhythm of mother and son, was gone. In its place was a strange, sterile silence that hummed under the fluorescent lights of the county jail. The air smelled of disinfectant and resignation. I sat on a hard plastic chair, waiting for the guard to wave me forward. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I kept them folded in my lap so no one could see. When they brought him in, I almost didn't recognize him. His hair had been cut unevenly, his skin was pale, and there was a shadow beneath his eyes that made him look older than his 26 years. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that didn't belong to him, but somehow fit perfectly, too perfectly. For a long time, we just stared at each other through the thick glass. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear him yet. When I finally picked up the phone receiver, his voice came through raw and distant, like it had traveled from another planet. That was the moment I realized where I was. I wasn't in my town anymore. I wasn't even on the same map. I had crossed into another universe, one made of rules I didn't understand and faces that didn't care. Here, love had no power. Here, a mother was just another visitor. I went home that evening and sat in my car in the driveway until it was dark. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, the sound rhythmic, almost soothing. But I couldn't bring myself to move. Inside that house were all the traces of him, the photos on the mantel, the scuffed shoes by the door, the smell of his shampoo in the bathroom. It felt like trespassing to walk in. When I finally did, I moved carefully, as if any noise might break the fragile illusion that he was just asleep in his room. Days turned into weeks. I started measuring time differently, not by shifts at work or seasons changing, but by letters, thin, folded papers that arrived from a correctional facility hours away. Sometimes they came once a week, sometimes not for a month. His handwriting had changed, jagged and uneven, like someone who had forgotten how to hold a pen. He never wrote much, just fragments. Food's bad? They moved me again. Stop sending money. Each word cut deeper than any silence could. I tried to write back. At first, I wrote long letters, full of memories and hopes, like if I filled the pages with enough love, it would seep through the bars and walls and reach him. I told him about the garden, about the weather, about small-town gossip he used to hate. But as the months passed, my letters grew shorter, more careful. I learned the rules of this new universe. Too much emotion scared him. Too much silence made him angry. I began writing in a language only mothers of prisoners understand, a language of restraint and coded affection. I'm proud of you became, I know you're doing your best. I love you became, take care of yourself. Sometimes I thought about visiting again, but the memory of that first encounter stopped me. The glass, the eyes, the hollow echo of his voice. I told myself I was giving him space, but maybe I was protecting myself from seeing the version of him I had created by calling 911. Guilt lived inside me now, like a second heartbeat, steady, constant, unrelenting. At work, I learned to keep my face neutral. People knew, of course. In a small town, everyone always knows. They'd lower their voices when I walked by, pretending it was out of respect. But it wasn't. It was curiosity wrapped in pity. I hated it. Some nights I'd drive past the fire station after my shift ended, watching the windows glow from the inside, wondering how many emergencies I had calmly handled while failing to contain the one growing in my own home. I started attending a support group at a church on the edge of town. Mothers, wives, sisters, all of us orbiting around the same black hole. We sat in a circle in a basement that smelled of coffee and old carpet, telling our stories in voices too steady to be natural. Every woman there had crossed a line once, called the police, signed a complaint, said enough. We all carried the same contradiction, love and betrayal living in the same chest. Some of them talked about forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that. Forgiveness felt like luxury, like something earned only by those who had found peace. I was still living in the in-between. At night, I began to dream differently. I stopped dreaming about the past, about birthday candles and laughter and small hands holding mine, and started dreaming about corridors, long, endless corridors that twisted and looped. I was always walking through them, searching for a door that wouldn't appear. Sometimes I heard his voice at the end, calling for me, but when I turned the corner, there was nothing, just silence and walls. I'd wake up gasping, the sheets twisted around me like restraints. Once, I received a letter from him written in pencil instead of pen. The handwriting was faint, the words smudged. He wrote that he hated me, that I had ruined his life, that he would never forgive me. I sat at the table, the paper shaking in my hands, and read it over and over until the words lost meaning. And then, quietly, I folded it, placed it back into the envelope, and put it in the drawer where I kept all his letters. I couldn't throw it away. I couldn't keep it visible. It became another ghost in the house, whispering when the wind moved through the cracks. Time in that other universe was strange. It stretched and collapsed unpredictably. Some days lasted forever. Others disappeared entirely. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, they became just numbers on a calendar, each one marked by the absence of him. I started talking to the air sometimes, softly, as if he could hear me from wherever he was. I told him about the garden, about the first frost, about how quiet the town felt without his laughter. It was a conversation across galaxies, mother to son, both lost in orbit. One afternoon, I drove out to the prison without planning to. I didn't go inside. I just parked across the road and sat there, staring at the high fences topped with coiled wire, glinting in the sun like something alive. Cars passed behind me, indifferent. I wondered if he knew I was there, if some part of him could feel me, sitting on the other side of that wall, trying to bridge a distance that couldn't be crossed. I stayed until the sun went down and the sky turned the color of bruised metal. Then I drove home in silence. That night I washed my hands for a long time. Not because they were dirty, but because I couldn't stand the feeling of them being still. The water was too hot, and my skin turned red, but I didn't stop. I thought about the weight of the phone that night, the sound of his voice saying nothing, the slow hum of the fluorescent light above us. I thought about how easily love can become guilt, how quickly protection can turn into punishment. In this new universe, I was both mother and executioner, savior and betrayer. There was no way to separate one from the other, and the cruelest part was knowing that, if I had to choose again, I might do the same thing. Because even now, in the quiet of my empty house, I still believed it was the only way to keep him alive. But belief didn't bring comfort, it just kept me breathing. And in this world of concrete walls and ghost letters, sometimes breathing was all that counted as survival. It started with a phone call in the middle of the night, the kind that slices through sleep like a blade and leaves the world disoriented. My first thought was that he was dead. My second was that maybe, finally, I could rest. Both thoughts made me sick with shame. The voice on the line was calm, procedural. They said my son had been moved to the prison infirmary. An incident. Self-inflicted injury. Stable, but under watch. The words were careful, stripped of emotion. I thanked them, though I didn't know what for, and hung up the phone. The room was dark, the kind of dark that feels alive. I sat there, listening to the sound of my own breathing, waiting for it to steady, but it didn't. By dawn, I was already in the car, driving through miles of mist and silence. The highway was empty, the world colorless. I could smell the metallic tang of rain coming, the kind that makes the sky taste like iron. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need anything else speaking to me. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Somewhere between one small town and the next, I caught sight of my reflection in the window and almost didn't recognize it. My face looked older, sharper, carved by worry and sleeplessness. I realized I hadn't smiled in months, maybe years. Not really. The prison loomed ahead, gray and sprawling, surrounded by fences that seemed to grow straight out of the earth. I parked, signed the forms, waited for clearance, moved through metal detectors, and locked gates that opened only to close again behind me. The echo of my footsteps followed me down long hallways, too clean, too bright. It felt like being swallowed by something mechanical and hungry. When they brought him into the room, he didn't look up right away. He was thinner than before, his wrists pale against the cuffs, his skin marked with faint bruises. He had the hollow look of someone who had run out of fight. I waited for him to speak, but he just sat there, staring at the table between us. I tried to find the right words, but language failed me. Everything sounded wrong in my head, too small, too human for what this moment was. He finally lifted his gaze, and for a fleeting second, I saw my child again. Not the addict, not the prisoner, just the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of the car, his hand clutching mine. That glimpse broke something open in me. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't understanding. It was grief, raw, consuming grief for the life neither of us could have back. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. I told him I was there, that I had come as soon as I heard, that I wanted to help. He looked at me then, truly looked, and in his eyes I saw everything I had been avoiding. The hatred, the disappointment, the bone-deep exhaustion. His voice, when it came, was quiet and flat. He told me he didn't want my help, that he hadn't wanted to live, that everything had become too heavy. And then, softer, almost like a confession, that he still blamed me. The words hit me harder than any slap could have. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I had done what I did to save him, that I had chosen the lesser evil because love had left me no other choice. But I couldn't say it, because deep down I wasn't sure anymore. I didn't know if I'd saved him or destroyed him in a slower, more civilized way. So I just sat there, nodding, the tears rising and receding in waves I refused to let break. When the guard came to take him back, he didn't say goodbye. He stood up, turned away, and I caught a glimpse of the scars running along his wrists, thin and pink and deliberate. My throat closed. The door shut behind him, and I felt something cold settle inside me. A certainty that the distance between us was no longer measured in miles or time, but in something much deeper, a kind of emotional gravity that neither of us could escape. Driving home, the rain finally came. It wasn't the sudden, cleansing kind, but steady and oppressive, like the sky had decided to weep without end. I pulled over once, my vision blurred by tears, and sat there gripping the steering wheel as if it could anchor me. The world outside was a blur of gray. I thought about how love, in its purest form, is supposed to be a tether, a connection strong enough to pull someone back from the edge. But what happens when the rope becomes a noose? When every act of saving turns into another form of suffocation? Days blurred together after that. I went through the motions of living, work, groceries, sleep, but each action felt detached, mechanical. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to phantom sounds, his laughter from another lifetime, the echo of the door slamming the day he was arrested, the low murmur of his voice calling me Mom before the word turned into a wound. I started walking in the evenings, circling the same 3 blocks over and over until my legs ached. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that hides judgment behind lace curtains. People looked at me with that particular mixture of pity and distance reserved for mothers of criminals. Their eyes said it all. She must have done something wrong. I stopped answering the phone. The world outside had nothing left to say that I wanted to hear. I poured all my focus into small, controllable things: the hiss of the kettle, the hum of the refrigerator, the rhythm of my breath. It was easier than thinking about him, about the boy I'd lost, and the man I couldn't reach. Sometimes, when the guilt grew too heavy, I'd drive to the edge of town and park by the water. The river had always been our place. When he was little, we used to sit on the bank and throw pebbles, counting the ripples. Now I sat alone, listening to the current move beneath the surface, dark and indifferent. I began writing him letters again, though I didn't know if they reached him. I didn't talk about forgiveness or faith. I didn't tell him to be strong. I just wrote about small things: the smell of the rain, the sound of the train passing at dusk, the way the roses bloomed late that year. It was my way of saying I was still here, that despite everything, the world was still moving, that maybe, somewhere, he could find a reason to stay. Weeks later, I received a letter back. The handwriting was uneven but familiar. He wrote that he had started attending group meetings inside, that it helped, a little, that he still couldn't look at himself without anger, but at the bottom, he had written something that made me stop breathing. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I think I understand why you did it. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was a door opening, a fraction, a crack in the wall between us. I pressed my fingers to the words, as if touch could make them real, as if paper could be a bridge between two separate worlds. That night, I dreamed of him again, but it was different. We were sitting by the river, and he wasn't a child anymore. He didn't speak, neither did I. The water was still, reflecting the sky in shades of silver and black. When I woke up, I felt the strangest calm, the kind that doesn't come from peace, but from surrender. I knew then that there was no going back to the life we'd had. There was no undoing the choices I'd made. The point of no return wasn't a single moment. It was every small decision, every silence, every time I looked away. It was love turning into survival, survival turning into guilt, guilt turning into acceptance. Somewhere along the line, I had crossed it, and now all that was left was to keep walking, through the ruin, through the remorse, through the long, quiet road that stretched ahead, because there was no saving to be done anymore. There was only living with what had already been lost. I used to think redemption was loud, a miracle moment, a clear sign, some kind of divine reckoning that washed the past away. I waited for it in the beginning, expecting something grand to arrive and tell me it was over, that I had survived the worst of it. But redemption was nothing like that. It came quietly, slowly, like the dawn that doesn't notice itself until the light has already filled the room. The first glimmer of that light came one morning when I woke before the alarm. The house was still wrapped in darkness, the air heavy with the scent of coffee I hadn't made yet. For the first time in months, I realized I had slept through the night. No dreams, no restless turning. My body had simply surrendered to rest. That small fact felt monumental. I sat up, wrapped myself in the blanket, and watched the faint outline of the window shift from gray to blue. The world was waking up again, and for once, I wanted to wake up with it. I began walking in the early hours before work, tracing the quiet streets of my neighborhood as the sun crept up behind the trees. The streets were empty, the world softened by dew, the silence tender instead of threatening. At first, I walked because I didn't know what else to do, but over time, I found rhythm in it. The sound of my shoes against the pavement, the slow rise and fall of my breath, the simple repetition of movement. It was the first thing that made sense again, the first thing that didn't hurt. I started noticing things I hadn't seen in years. The way the light caught on the church steeple at sunrise, the cluster of wildflowers that grew stubbornly between cracks in the sidewalk, the smell of freshly baked bread drifting from the corner bakery that opened before dawn. Small, ordinary things, but they began to feel sacred, like proof that life still existed outside my guilt. It was strange how the world kept offering beauty, even to those who felt undeserving of it. I wrote more letters, not to my son this time, but to myself. I didn't write about what had happened. I wrote about what I saw, what I felt, what I hoped I might one day forgive. I wrote about wanting to live without drowning in memory. I left the letters folded in a shoebox under my bed, never reading them twice. They weren't confessions, they were anchors, words that tethered me to something that resembled survival. At work, people stopped looking at me the way they used to. Maybe they had grown used to the story. Maybe I had just learned how to hold myself differently. My voice returned, steady, professional, almost warm. When I answered emergency calls, I felt a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. The fear, the desperation on the other end of the line, it no longer startled me. It felt familiar. I had lived inside that kind of panic. I knew how to speak to it. Maybe that was my purpose now, to give the calm I had once needed. One afternoon during lunch break, I wandered outside and found a stray cat curled under a tree behind the station. It was thin, dirty, its fur matted in clumps. When I reached out, it flinched but didn't run. I brought it food the next day, and the day after that. Eventually, it began to wait for me. That small creature became my first act of unconditional care since everything had fallen apart. I named her Hope, not because I was sentimental, but because I needed the reminder. It was around that time I joined a group at the community center, a support circle for parents of addicts. I told myself I was just there to listen, to observe, but the first time I spoke, my voice cracked halfway through the sentence. I hadn't realized how long I had gone without saying his name out loud. The people in that room didn't pity me. They didn't look away. Their eyes held the same kind of tired knowing that lived in my own. We didn't fix each other, but we shared the burden of understanding. That was enough. Some of them had lost their children completely. Others were still fighting to bring them back. I was somewhere in between, floating in the gray space where loss and endurance coexist. I began volunteering to help organize meetings, set up chairs, make coffee. It was something small, something repetitive, but it gave me structure. I learned that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about giving the pain somewhere to go. Months passed. Seasons changed. The air grew warmer, the trees bloomed, the streets filled with laughter again. I wasn't part of that laughter, not yet, but I could listen to it without breaking. I started planting roses again in the backyard, the same kind I used to grow when my world was still whole. My hands, stiff from years of tension, learned softness again through the soil. Watching something fragile take root and thrive under care was the closest I had come to faith. One evening, after a long day, I came home to find an envelope in the mailbox. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. I stood there on the porch for a long time, turning it over in my hands, afraid to open it. When I finally did, my knees went weak. It wasn't long, just a few sentences written in pencil on lined paper. He said he was in a program now. He said he was trying. He said he didn't know if he could be forgiven, but he wanted to try anyway. And at the bottom, 3 words that I hadn't seen from him in years. I love you. I read it again and again until the words blurred. The tears came slowly, quietly, the kind that felt more like release than sorrow. I pressed the letter to my chest, as if it could fill the hollow space that had lived there for so long. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the years or the pain or the choices that had brought us here. But it was enough. It was light, small, fragile, flickering, but real. After that, I began to write to him again. Not about the past, not about forgiveness, but about the world as I saw it now. The sunrise on the river, the stray cat who waited for me, the roses that had begun to bloom. I wanted him to know that the world could still be kind, that even broken people could build something from the ruins. I didn't expect a reply. I just needed him to know I hadn't stopped believing in his survival. As spring gave way to summer, the air filled with the sound of cicadas, that endless hum of life moving forward. I sat on the porch most evenings, watching the light fade behind the trees. Sometimes I'd imagine him out there somewhere, seeing the same sky, breathing the same humid air. The thought no longer filled me with grief. It filled me with something quieter, steadier, a strange, stubborn peace. That was what light looked like, I realized. Not a blinding burst, not a revelation, just the slow, persistent glow of a heart still beating after everything. A light that didn't erase the darkness, but learned to live beside it. And in that fragile balance, I began to understand what it meant to keep going, not because the pain had ended, but because I had finally learned how to walk through it without losing myself completely. The tunnel hadn't vanished, but for the first time, I could see the way out. The day he came home, I stood in the kitchen cutting apples, pretending not to check the clock every 2 minutes. The knife moved mechanically through the fruit, slices falling into a glass bowl one after another. But my mind wasn't in that room. It hadn't been for days. It wandered the corridors of the prison where he had spent the last 18 months, curled itself around the image of him sitting in silence on a narrow cot, counting seconds like I counted cuts. I didn't know what to expect when the door opened. I didn't know who would walk through it. My son, a stranger, or someone in between. He arrived with one small bag and no expression. His shoulders were tense, his eyes constantly scanning the room, as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. His hair was longer, his jaw sharper, and there was something about the way he carried himself, half ready to run, half ready to collapse, that told me prison hadn't saved him. It had only paused the fall. We didn't hug. I didn't ask why. I just stepped aside and let him pass through the threshold. He stood in the middle of the living room, like someone dropped into a replica of a place they used to live, trying to remember what belonged where. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The walls still held his childhood drawings. The bookshelf still bent under his favorite novels, but time had worn through the floorboards and left a new kind of silence there, one that throbbed with everything we hadn't said. For the first few weeks, we lived like ghosts under the same roof, moving quietly around each other, speaking only when necessary, never lingering in the same room too long. He slept on the old couch in the den, a pillow tucked under his arm like a barrier. I left food on the stove and always made sure there was fresh coffee. He ate when I wasn't looking. I cleaned when he was asleep. We orbit each other like planets that used to share a sky, but had long since drifted apart. I tried not to watch him, but I did. I noticed how he flinched when the phone rang or how he hesitated before turning on the faucet, as if expecting something to go wrong. He had a habit of checking the locks 3 times before bed. Some nights I heard him pacing in the hallway, whispering to himself, or humming under his breath like he was trying to anchor his thoughts. I never interrupted. I didn't know what kind of war he was fighting in his head. I just knew I couldn't fight it for him anymore. He got a job at the auto shop a few blocks away. Nothing fancy, just oil changes and tire rotations, but it gave his hands something to do. He came home with grease on his sleeves and the smell of sweat in his clothes, and I could see a flicker of something returning. Focus, maybe, or stubbornness. Some nights he fell asleep sitting up. Other nights I heard him crying through the vents, quiet, muffled sounds that cracked something deep in my chest. I didn't go to him. I just pressed my hand to the wall and let the sound pass through my skin. There were setbacks, days when he disappeared for hours without explanation, nights when he came home with his jaw clenched and his eyes empty. He never admitted when he'd relapsed, but I could see it in the way his hands shook, in the tension that radiated off his body like static. Once, I found a crumpled pill bottle in the trash with someone else's name on the label. I didn't say anything, I just cleaned around it. I knew better than to think I could control the fall. All I could do was stay on the other side of the door, hoping he'd walk through it again. People in town avoided him. Some avoided me, too. Their stares had softened into something quieter, less disgust, more discomfort, a subtle, lingering judgment that seeped into grocery store aisles and church pews. I heard whispers when we stood in line together. I felt the pause in conversations when we passed by. I stopped trying to explain. Let them wonder. Let them gossip. They hadn't lived in our skin. They hadn't stood at the edge of that decision. But the hardest part wasn't the town. It was me. It was living inside a house where every room echoed with the before, where memories pressed against the walls like trapped voices, where I could no longer tell the difference between hope and dread. I kept expecting peace to arrive like a reward for surviving, but it didn't. Instead, I lived with a low hum of fear, not fear of him, fear for him, fear that one night he wouldn't come back. That one phone call would undo everything we'd built from the rubble. Freedom was not the clean slate I had imagined. It was a landscape scarred by survival, where trust had to be rebuilt brick by brick, and every day was another fragile negotiation with the past. He was free, yes, but tethered to 1,000 invisible weights: parole meetings, drug tests, job warnings, his own guilt. And I was free too, free from the secrecy, from the midnight visits to hospital ERs, from the stifling shame. But in that freedom lived another kind of prison, the kind built from love that had been weaponized, forgiveness that came too slowly, and the aching question that still lived in my chest: did I do the right thing? One afternoon, I found him in the backyard building something. A bench, it turned out, made from old wood he'd pulled from the shed. He didn't ask if I wanted it. He just kept working, his sleeves rolled up, the muscles in his arms flexing with each swing of the hammer. I watched from the window, unseen, the way I had watched him as a boy piecing together toy models with the same fierce concentration. It was the first time I had seen purpose in him again. When he finished, he didn't say anything, just left the bench near the garden and disappeared into the house. That evening, I sat on it alone, the wood still warm from the sun. It wasn't perfect. The legs wobbled slightly. The stain was uneven, but it held my weight. It held my sorrow. It held the quiet truth of who we were now, broken, mending, still standing. Sometimes he sat next to me. We didn't talk much, just watched the sky dim together. That was our new language: presence, not words. Being there, not fixing. He still didn't call me Mom. I still didn't ask why. Maybe the names we used for each other had changed. Maybe the love had too. But it was still there, muted, weathered, alive. I no longer believed in happy endings. I didn't need them. What I believed in was the long, unfinished work of staying. The way a mother keeps showing up, even after trust has been shattered. The way a son tries again and again to outrun the ghosts he once invited in. What I believed in was the quiet strength of small things: the smell of cut grass, the sound of tools in the shed, the silence that no longer felt cruel. Freedom had not come like a door swinging open. It had come like a window cracked just enough to let the air shift. And though I still lived with fear, I also lived with breath, with the knowledge that some cages follow you. And still, you learn to live inside them, not as punishment, but as proof that you survived. And sometimes, when the light was just right, I could almost believe we were free, even if that freedom had a lock on the other side.